Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Learning Science Outside the Classroom. My name is Eric Robelin. I'm a reporter at Education Week, and I'm pleased to be moderating today's discussion. This webinar builds on a special report that Education Week published earlier this month about the field often referred to as informal science education. Special thanks go to the Noyce Foundation, which provided financial support for that report, and which also is sponsoring today's webinar. The starting point for the Education Week report was concern about the lackluster levels of student achievement in science seen in this country. So often, schools alone are seen as the sole place to address this challenge. But many experts say schools can't do it alone. As the National Research Council declared in a 2009 report, beyond the schoolhouse door, opportunities for science learning abound. Zoos and science centers, robotics clubs, science competitions and online educational games, even collecting rocks or taking a walk in the park. These are but a few of the options to spark young people's curiosity and excitement and to help them learn about science and related subjects. I can tell you that as an education reporter, researching the field of informal science education was very eye-opening and educational for me. It was a great reminder that newspapers like Education Week probably should pay more attention to learning outside the classroom. Recent developments suggest informal science learning is gaining wider recognition and becoming part of the national dialogue on how to advance public understanding of science. Two experts join Education Week today to discuss the evolving work in informal science learning, what it looks like in practice, what we know about its impact, the potential for advancing learning, and the challenges in making the most of it, as well as expanding access to such opportunities. I'm pleased to be joined today by John Falk, a professor of free choice science learning at Oregon State University and the director of that university's Center for Research on Lifelong STEM Learning. We're also joined by Alan Friedman, the former director and CEO of the New York Hall of Science, a highly regarded science center in New York City. Alan is now a consultant in museum development and science communication, and he's also a member of the National Assessment Governing Board, which is the governing body for NAEP, the nation's report card. We want this webinar to be an interactive experience, so don't be shy about asking questions at any time during the hour that we have. Simply type into the Ask a Question window on your webinar display. We'll do our best to address as many questions as possible in the time allowed. Also, this webinar will be available on demand within 24 hours of today's event, and the PowerPoint slides will also be available to download. You'll be receiving an email with a link to the archive and slides once they are ready. You will also be able to access the webinar archive from our homepage at www.edweek.org. That's enough from me. Let's begin our discussion. I'd like to welcome again John Falk to help us get started. Take it away, John.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to attempt to, very briefly in the next few minutes, give you a quick rundown on when and why people learn science and what sources they use to learn science. And this really is just, as much as anything, a backgrounder for our listeners. So when do people learn science? Well, the short answer is all the time, 24/7 and throughout the entire lifespan. What is important to appreciate is that by the time, over the course of a lifetime, the average individual will actually spend less than 3% of their time in any kind of formal instruction. So the vast majority of our waking hours are spent outside of school. We live in a very interesting age where the traditional gatekeepers of knowledge, schools, libraries, government, no longer are in total control of information, where the boundaries between where and when and why we learn are disappearing. And in essence, learning is continuous and cumulative across our life. So whether you're watching a television show or taking a class or going to a science center, all of that information is cumulative in terms of our understanding of various concepts. Just to sort of visually get a sense of this, we can think of a life space of 70-plus years of life, 12 months out of the year, waking hours between 7 in the morning and 11 at night. And we see that formal education, K-12, and even if you go to college for 4 years, is just a little space and takes up just a little bit of that entire life space. Why do people learn science? Well, again, people learn science for a vast array of reasons. Probably the first and foremost, the biggest reason people learn science is to satisfy their own personal curiosity and interest. They're part of a conversation and something comes up and they want to pursue that topic further. Obviously, science and technology is increasingly part of our work life, and so an awful lot of investment is made on the job in terms of people learning science and technology. Little known fact, business and industry probably spends as much, if not more money, on education for their workers than is spent in the K-12 schoolroom. People also learn because they have hobbies, and not everybody thinks of their hobby as a science and technology related hobby, but if you're a gardener, there's plenty of science related to that. Even cooking has science and technology issues related to it in chemistry, and so hobbies are a big source of people learning science. We learn science to support the needs of others. Parents learn a tremendous amount of science in terms of supporting their children while doing homework or walking through a zoo or a science center. We also learn science out of need. So we may not know anything about a particular health issue until perhaps a loved one is diagnosed with cancer or heart disease. And then all of a sudden we're highly motivated to learn an awful lot about those particular topics. And we will spend days, weeks, maybe even years becoming expert in that particular area of illness or environmental problem or something like that. And then obviously people learn science in school too, or for other career-related needs. So if I am planning on trying to pass a board exam, I will learn an awful lot of science in order to do that. But we typically prioritize where people learn science, starting with school, but actually all these other reasons that I've listed first turn out to be equally, if not more important, to why people learn science. Here's a little bit of data. This was actually developed by a researcher named Robert Tye and his colleagues at the University of Virginia. It was a little stunning. This was based on long-term data, national data, looking at the trajectories of students across their school careers through graduate school. And they were trying to see what was the probability of various different factors of predicting that someone would end up getting a degree in the sciences, either the biological sciences or the physical sciences. Turned out the single factor that was most important in determining whether someone ended up getting a degree in science was whether by the 8th grade that child expected to have a career in science. In other words, by the time children were in middle school, they had pretty much made up their mind whether science was a topic of interest to them. And that was most typically because of factors that were happening not in school but outside of school. Not only that, what has traditionally been thought to be the great gatekeeper for pursuing careers in science, which was performance in mathematics, although it was slightly significant, was nowhere near as important as this interest in science at an early age in terms of predicting future careers. So what are the sources that significantly contribute to STEM learning? And here's where we get sort of to the meat of this topic that we're engaged in at the moment. Well, again, we have typically looked at learning as being somewhat unilaterally driven by schooling, but there are many, many other parts of this vast science learning infrastructure, all of which contribute. So just going around the circle, and I hope you can see my pointer there, starting with the Internet. Internet at the moment is rapidly becoming the single greatest source of science information, both general and specific, that the public uses, young and old alike. And this is particularly true. Obviously, the younger you are, the more likely you are to use the Internet as a source of science learning. For years, people also have been using print media, in particular newspapers, books, and the like, magazines. We learn a lot of science from friends and family, from hobby groups, from the workplace, as I mentioned. People learn science through different community organizations, through 4-H, Scouts, things like that, after-school programs. Museums, I have that in quote because I throw into the museums things like national parks and zoos and aquariums, as well as science centers. Obviously, a very large contributor to public understanding of science are things like the electronic media, TV, radio, film, which historically was the largest single source, but it is on the verge of being eclipsed by the Internet. And then, obviously, we learn science from schools and universities. Although these circles are all the same size, the truth is all of these resources contribute to an individual's science learning. And for some individuals, some are more important, and on some days, some are more important. But all of them, over the course of a lifetime, are important contributors. In the last decade or more, there's been a lot of emphasis on after-school programs and a lot of investment in trying to improve the quality of after-school programs. This is just a relatively recent review of over 50 after-school programs, which basically showed that these were not insignificant in the lives of the children who participated. These are not science-specific. These are just in general. That participation in quality after-school programs improved school attendance, engagement and learning, test scores and grades, as well as frequency and duration of after-school participation increased a whole range of other benefits, which we often underestimate as being important, but in this day and age of high-stakes testing. But after-school programs increased benefits such as collaboration, self-esteem, and a range of other issues that ultimately have to do with the whole child. And it shows that these studies actually showed that high-risk youth in particular had the greatest benefits. And it's interesting, one of the bits of data that are emerging is that although high-risk youth are often underrepresented at a lot of out-of-school learning experiences, when they do participate, they actually benefit more than their middle class and more privileged peers. And that's a really important fact to keep in mind. So finally, what I wanted to show you is some results of research that I've recently completed in Los Angeles. Now, these were looking at adults and looking over the course of a lifetime, what were the factors that contributed to the public science knowledge. And you don't have to deal with all the statistics, but the important thing to appreciate was that, first of all, two things. If you look at the far right column, all of these factors are significantly important in contributing to science knowledge. Formal education system is important, K-12 as well as higher education, childhood out-of-school experiences, adult out-of-school experiences, workplace experiences, and by privilege, I'm talking about things like income, being of majority population, being male versus female, all of those things that we've known about and were concerned about for many years do emerge in this data as well. But if you look at this second column here, what's the R-squared column, what it shows is that whereas formal education and childhood free choice learning experiences and workplace experiences and privilege all explain what R-squared represents as explaining the variance. What explains the most in terms of the adult science knowledge? They are all explaining roughly comparable amounts of the variance, whereas adult out-of-school time is explaining twice that amount of variance. Now, in some ways, that's not surprising because adults are spending most of their time outside of school. But clearly, out-of-school child experiences are explaining as much of the variance as schooling does. And what it suggests that if we really want to come up with solutions for improving the quality of science education in this country, if we continue to invest 99 cents out of every dollar on the formal education system that is ultimately not going to totally solve the problem, because much of the science learning that is occurring in this country is occurring in that other 97%, 95 or greater percent of the time that people spend outside of school. And so we need to think about how are we going to invest not just in improving the quality of education in the formal education sector, but we also need to invest in thinking about in the informal sector. So this pretty much sums up what I've just said. The public learn science across their life from many places and for many reasons, particularly for their own personal needs and interests. Out-of-school experiences make a significant contribution to the public's learning. And the important takeaway message here is science learning is never-ending and cumulative process. So we all need to figure out ways to work together and see how we can synergistically build experiences across all of the places and spaces and times that people learn science, in school and out of school.
Thanks so much, John Falk, for that. We really appreciate it. Now I'd like to welcome Alan Friedman. Alan, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, Eric and John. What I'm going to do is to talk about the practical side of what John has presented. John has, I think, made a very compelling case, at least I earned my living from his case, that informal science education really counts, that it's a huge part of how people learn, even people who are in school and in classrooms. In practice, what's available then? What kind of organizations and opportunities are there for people to participate in informal science education? And by people, I really mean as broad an audience as possible. For school kids, for senior citizens, for scientists themselves, for parents, for preschoolers, what's out there. So what I'm going to talk about are the ways in which we are able to make use of these facilities. Again, I'm partly repeating John here. What we're talking about is all the things you can do in the roughly 95% of your life that you're not in the school system. John and his wife and co-faculty member have coined the term free choice learning to describe this, because people often don't think of this as education. They think of it as, hey, I want to do this, it's fun, I want to learn something about this. Again, we're talking about experiences as varied as those you can have in aquariums, museums, zoos, botanic gardens, visitor centers, television, magazines, books, libraries, the internet, hobbies. These are all opportunities at which you may well learn science, whether you know you're doing it or not. And to give you an idea of how large this business is, NSF studies have found 61% of all adults physically visit an informal learning institution at least once a year. So, what are these? What are they like? Well, the part that's been the most rapidly growing are a kind of science museum called science centers. When I started in this field 30-something years ago, there were 17 of these in the United States in the 1970s. There's now 350, and the number is still growing. This part of informal learning is about $1 billion a year industry, and 177 million people a year go to these places. About 60 million of those are kids on school field trips. So it's a significant player, at least in numbers, if not in hours, in formal education as well. What are they like, these 350 or so centers? The remarkable thing is everyone is different. When you go in one, you know it's not the same as the last one you visited. This is a website called tryscience.org, tryscience.org, that lets you sample hundreds of these places and see what kind of exhibits they have, what kind of programs, what kind of experiences on the weekends do they offer. So very varied. They learn a lot from each other, but each one offers a different experience to their users. and some specialize in preschool or senior citizens or people who are well educated in science or people who are total newcomers to it, all different. Just a few pictures to show you the variety of experiences. Some are things, the picture in the upper left, where you have a piece of apparatus in front of you, you manipulate it. Others, like the cathedral outline in plastic through crossed polarizers, you have one interaction. You can increase the stress on this cathedral and see how the shape changes. Others are things you look at, walk through, walk into, build yourself. Basically, every kind of experience one can imagine is available. Now let's move outside of the science museums per se. There's a movement that began about 25 years ago at the Cornell Laboratory of Ornithology that's now become viral. It's worldwide. And that is enlisting ordinary people of all ages with no prior training to actually collect scientific data. At Cornell, it began with collecting data on birds with kids in Harlem, in New York City, counting pigeons. And it wasn't just an exercise for the kids. This is real data that's actually used by scientists at Cornell and elsewhere to measure changes in population of birds. And you might think, well, these amateurs gathering data? Would scientists write papers trusting their career reputations to work done by people they don't even know with no training? You bet they would when the data is this good. The data, for example, on bird migration that we have because of citizen science groups all across the United States, roughly 10 times more data and sharper data than we've ever had before. So you can become involved collecting real data from your own window, in your own schoolyard, in the nearest park, in places you visit on vacation. This generally comes under the calling of citizen science. The web. We can't get away from it. You're looking at it right now, and there are literally thousands of websites. The difficulty here is that some of the websites that you can find online explaining science, teaching science, inviting you to do science are junk. Others are superb, and one difficulty is knowing which is which. Here's one that I think is superb, nobelprize.org. It's about Nobel Prize winners, but it offers you real stories, video, audio, animations, and the opportunity to do experiments, the same ones that Nobel laureates did, but you get to control the variables, and they're exquisite simulations. So a lot of stuff on the web, again, with the main problem being separating the wheat from the chaff. Here's another site. This one is particularly targeted at school kids. It began because teachers and kids and parents wanted to have a science fair project beyond just building that model of the volcano, which we all love, but not very original. This site has hundreds of really exciting real science projects to which we don't know the answers. And it's since expanded to offering career advice and profiles and how much could you earn if you went into this field in science and what kind of courses do you need to take. So a lot of good resources on the web when you can find them. Television, of course, is also a huge player. And there's good science on television like Nova. There's not so good science like In Search of Extraterrestrial Beings for people who think they have found them. Here's a site and a TV show called Design Squad, targeted at teenagers to encourage them to think about engineering. And it's one of those Saturday morning programs you have to get up early to watch, but people do get up early to watch it. And they hold physical events in cities around the country. It has a huge and growing following. And anyone who watches it even for 10 minutes will learn a lot, watching the kids on this show respond to engineering challenges. Science Friday, Ira Flato on radio is one of my very favorite sources, and it has a huge following. In addition to the millions of people who listen to it on radio, You can find it, both video and audio segments on the web. There are podcasts and blogs and tweets. A lot of people who profess no interest in science listen to Science Friday every week. It's an example of how, without a lot of high tech, you can explain, communicate an enormous amount of science if you just have someone like Ira and his crew who are really genuinely curious and ask good questions of their guests. Teachers are formal educators, but they often take training in science museums. In fact, they take more training in science museums than they do in universities once they've gotten their degree and they're out there. And apprenticeships in places like science museums and zoos and aquaria and after-school programs are a terrific way to get into science teaching, and also an excellent way for kids who are not going to become teachers but maybe will become scientists to learn the pleasures of explaining what they do to others. Well, there's always been a connection between what happens out of school and what happens in school. I will offer you just my thought that there are real dangers in saying, well, let's just merge these, or let's make sure all of this informal learning industry serves the needs of the schools, because they really are different. And it's that difference that we need to treasure at least as much as we treasure how they directly are compatible with each other. What happens in the out-of-school, informal, free choice world is not always as, quote, serious, as structured, as integral to a curriculum as what happens in school. But maybe that's a good thing. In fact, one could argue that schools should become more like museums rather than museums becoming more like school. To some extent, that's happening as schools begin to rely on the Internet and museums and field trips and citizen science to communicate things about science. So I think there's a need to recognize the differences between how we learn in a formal setting and how we learn outside, and to respect the potential for these differences. Finally, here are just a few of the kind of resources you can find. Just the informal learning realm, as an earlier study that John Falk did demonstrated, is very well organized, but only by individual sectors. So the people who work in zoos and aquaria don't talk as much as we might think they should, the people who work in science museums or in television and radio. The after-school folks have their own communities, their own networks, their own organizations. So you pretty much have to explore this field line by line. If you want an experience, if you want to share an experience, you'll have to do a little hunting. There's no single source, although the Center for Advancement of Informal Science Education, listed at the top here, is probably the most comprehensive track to finding these other opportunities for out-of-school learning. And that's what I have to say.
Thanks so much, Alan. It was a great presentation as well. And we're now going to get into the Q&A session here. And I'm going to actually start with a question for you, John, about measurement and something we in the education world are obsessed with, measuring learning and so forth. And we have one of our audience members who asked, how do we measure understanding of science concepts gained outside of a school setting? I take it the measurement there is viewed as different. Can you say a little about that?
Sure. Well, the short answer is measuring understanding of science, whether it's in school or out of school, is challenging, and it is not for the faint of heart. One of the things that I will say to the credit of those who've been working in the out-of-school setting is, and not to cast aspersions on measurement in school settings, but because out-of-school experiences are often so ephemeral, the challenge often is not, what's important is not whether they know something as they leave a museum, or if they know something at the end of a 1-hour after-school program. The real test is if you come back a year or 2 or 3 years later, how have they made sense of that experience, and have they used that experience within their lives? Now, if you use that standard, actually all of us find measuring learning much more challenging. And that's really the standard that schools, to be honest, haven't always addressed, is that longer term and application to it. I know I would refer people to a number of sources. There is, you mentioned, Eric, in the 2009 National Academy's study called Learning Science in Informal Environments. And although there's not a lot of specifics in that report, there is a huge bibliography of research that they comb through. And that includes loads and loads of different efforts to accomplish this. And really, as Alan alluded, the challenge has been that there hasn't been a single, because this informal science education community is diffuse and not really functioning as a community, there isn't a single way that anybody has tried to measure learning. So if you look within the Science Museum community, you'll find dozens and dozens of different approaches to this problem. And those approaches are different than the way people have historically tried to measure the impact of programs like 3-2-1 Contact and television, science television programs, which is again different than the way people have tried to measure the science learning of children in after-school programs. And so in some ways, without getting down into the weeds of literally looking at specific examples, it's really hard to answer that question. There have been a lot of efforts to do that, and I think one of the things that, though, is emerging is that cumulatively there is pretty good data now that shows that children in particular, but adults as well, do significantly learn science in these out-of-school experiences, much like that data that I showed you earlier would suggest. But the specifics are challenging to talk about.
Thanks very much for that, John. Here's another question from one of our viewers. Many out-of-school science, and I'll turn this one to Alan. Many out-of-school science learning opportunities feel authentic but not detailed. They seem more intuitive. We seem to avoid the mathematical models to describe the science, for example. Is this a problem for learning the depth of science across the public? I worry that it spreads science light or even misconceptions about science.
Good question. And first I'll say, I think most of us in the informal world, informal science education world, do feel a little guilty about mathematics. There is, in fact, a mathematics museum opening in New York City shortly, but it's extremely rare. And mathematics isn't part of a lot of exhibits, a lot of websites. So since mathematics is the language of science, since just about all scientists use mathematics every day, aren't we really presenting a very skewed picture of the world when we present science without it? It would be if our job were to produce scientists and we were the one-stop shop, the informal world, where you learn to become a scientist. As John described in many studies, including the study from Robert Tye and his associates, we know that motivation to learn science, even if you don't have the mathematics, is a better predictor of whether you in fact do go on to do science than how good you are in math. May seem counterintuitive. A lot of what we do is to get people interested in enough to work on it on their own. And so a lot of what we measure, going back to the question John just answered, is not cognitive gains. How many equations did you learn per hour in your visit to the Science Museum or watching NOVA on TV? It's rather how motivated are you to keep learning about this topic even after the TV show is over, even after your experience in the zoo is complete. And it turns out we can measure this, and it's very real, and it's a significant effect. So what we try to do is to deal with things at the level that people happen to be at And frankly, most of them are not at the level where they say, oh, gee, I wish I had the calculus for that. Most people are at a level where they say, oh, gee, this is really interesting. I had no idea. You know, I don't understand that. I see where they're getting, but I wonder how they figured out. And then they go to the web, they go to friends, they maybe take a class, and pretty soon they're doing the math, if the math is what they need to get where they're going. I should say occasionally people even get fascinated by the math itself, particularly in things like statistical studies of population dynamics. A colleague of mine was the former supervisor of math for the Milwaukee Public Schools, and he came up with these marvelous activities which people with just a little bit of mathematics can discover all sorts of secrets of life and populations by looking at changing population dynamics, whether the average population is getting older or younger or richer or poorer, and figuring out what could be causing that. So, yes, we are not doing a whole lot of math, largely because 90-something% of our visitors are math phobic. We would like to fix that, but the way we try to do it in the informal learning world is begin by making them fascinated by a topic for which math will help them advance further.
Thanks very much, Alan. John, I'm going to ask you one more research question. I promise I'll let you branch out beyond that. But another interesting question we got that dives a little bit more into this with the school's sort of perspective or angle is, are there any models of successful collaborations between public schools and informal science education institutions that demonstrate greater student achievement in STEM subjects?
Actually, there are a number of them, but the one that comes to mind, and Alan may know of others, but the one that I think is quite phenomenal is the work of the Liberty Science Center in New Jersey, where the Liberty Science Center pretty much took on the responsibility of organizing and providing science education for most of the state of New Jersey, but particularly for all of those districts that have historically been challenged, are the most underrepresented and the least poorest performing districts in the state. And so basically the Liberty Science Center has created this entire science education program that includes teacher training and family training, in-classroom experiences and field trips to the Science Center, but it is a major statewide effort to have a out-of-school institution, namely the Liberty Science Center, take primary responsibility for science education within a state. I don't know if Alan knows of another example, but that one's pretty astounding.
Alan, do you want to chime in there?
Yes. The Pacific Science Center has similar experiences, which they run the state's LASER program, which is a statewide systemic reform initiative in science, and they've had very positive results. To give a non-museum example, Project Exploration, which is an after-school and summer program in Chicago, has astonishing results of kids' test scores improving in classrooms using standardized tests as a result of their participation in this program. And these are controlled studies, quite reliable ones. In Israel, Mada Tech Science Museum started working with a particular minority of people who came from Africa to Israel and had all sorts of difficulties with language and culture, and they increased their average test scores by participating in programs at the Science Museum from something like, I don't remember the exact number, I think it was 15% below the national average to 10% above the national average. So yes, we have data like this. One caution, though, the data we're looking at for performance in schools is largely based on standardized tests that are designed to test what happens in the classroom. It's a little surprising that things that happen outside of the classroom can have such a positive effect when they're not designed to do that. Again, what we try and design most programs in the informal world for are to boost motivation, attitude, interest, and behaviors, like doing further learning on television or in museums or on the Internet. Those are not things that are measured on standardized tests in the classroom. And I should say, as a member of the National Assessment Governing Board, I'm a big fan of really good classroom testing. But we're not asking the kinds of things we would expect to come out of informal learning. The bottom line, however, is yes, we have examples and it does work.
Thanks, Alan. John, a question, and Alan, you can certainly chime in here too, but we at Education Week certainly love questions about policy. So, and I remember when I was doing some of the research for this whole report, the questions about policy implications kept coming to my mind. What do you view as the most pressing state and federal policy barriers for informal science education experiences to positively impact student learning in the classroom? And I'll extend that also to the barriers, policy barriers to just, advancing this whole field of informal science and making it more widely available.
I'll be happy to start that, but the real expert on this call here is Alan, since he headed up a year-long study of this very issue.
That's a great reminder.
As part of the Center for the Advancement of Informal Science Education. So, in deference to Alan, maybe I'll let Alan start with that question, if that's okay, Alan.
Sure. And yes, what John's referring to is a report by a group of people who worked for a year looking at all the different kinds of policy issues that affect informal science learning. And you can find that on the website of the Center for the Advancement of Informal Science Education, which is insci.org, insci.org. If you look under publications, you'll find it. There are a lot of policy implications for promoting or retarding informal science education. Largely, many of them revolve around funding. Where's the money go? And as John pointed out, 99% of our tax money that goes for education goes to classroom education. And if we're at 1%, we consider ourselves lucky. In the entire world, television, radio, zoos, aquariums, after school, it's almost an afterthought. Do we want to invest more in these? Do we want to invest more, especially at a time when we're having to cut back on just about everything? Well, some of us think we do, but that's a policy issue and we have to win our points by making convincing arguments and by doing webinars like the ones we're doing now and getting people to listen to it. I don't think it's a zero-sum game, actually. I think there's a lot of evidence from other countries that putting effort into successful forms of education, not only classroom but non-classroom, has huge dividends for national economies and competitiveness and all of this stuff. So, yes, there are also policy issues in terms of just attention, where what we talk about when President Obama had informal science educations come in for a program on the lawn of the White House, including telescopes and inflatable planetariums and learning activities coming from a variety of science museums. Huge boost for the field, just because we don't often get presidential attention or congressional attention. So I think attention, looking at funding, and looking at how we measure national success with standardized tests that either do or do not respect the kind of things like interest and attitude that we think are important. These are all policy issues for which we have a long way to go.
And I would just chime in that specifically answering the question in terms of how experiences could positively impact student learning in the classroom, I think the single biggest policy decision we could make is to recognize that learning is not about what happens in the classroom. What happens in the classroom is a piece of learning, but we have historically framed success in education as success in school, as opposed to seeing success in school as part of the educational process. And so the biggest policy decision we could make is to truly recognize that learning is lifelong, life-wide, and cumulative, and that only a piece of what's important for achieving an educated society happens in school. And that would be liberating for those who work in classrooms, and it would certainly be liberating for those who work outside of classrooms. That would be a huge policy change. Just redefining what is the focus of the learning landscape.
Thanks very much. Next question is, what is required to take a young person from being disinterested or turned off to science to being interested and turned on to science? John, do you want to take a stab at that?
I'll take a stab. It's a very challenging question. In fact, as Alan knows, my colleagues and I at Oregon State, and with a colleague also who's from University of Colorado, are about to launch into a long-term investigation to actually try and understand and model that, because we have a lot of theories about what it takes to get somebody interested or disinterested. What are the factors that determine someone's interest or disinterest in science? But we actually don't have a lot of good data for that. The reason for that is sort of apropos to my last question. We have primarily looked at that question in terms of what it takes within a classroom context to get someone interested or disinterested in science. But as the Robert Tye data shows and other data shows, that even children are spending only about 20% of their waking hours in a classroom. And those 20%, and so children can become very, very engaged in science. In fact, there's anecdotal data that if you interview, for example, Nobel laureates, 75%, if I get this number correct, Alan, if my memory serves me, 75% of Nobel laureates say they became initially interested in science because of experiences that happened outside of the school classroom. But because of that engagement and interest outside of the classroom, then obviously they needed to do better in school, which was the gateway to allowing them to become scientists. And so I think again, I don't want to just continually say that this is complex, but this is complex. And we have only the beginnings of understanding of how this works. We know that, for example, experiences like going to science centers, going to zoos and aquariums, watching shows on television can be very effective at sparking interest. But we also actually know that unless something happens to follow up on that, that interest can wane. So what we haven't been good as a society is creating the mechanisms that support that budding interest and building networks that allow children, as they become interested in a topic, to actually pursue that, particularly into that critical period of adolescence where ennui sort of overwhelms everything. And you can, whereas children at the elementary school age are curious and excited about science in particular, but lots of things in general, a lot of that interest gets basically squelched in the middle school years, both in school and out of school. And we need to find better mechanisms as a society for ensuring that that doesn't happen.
Thanks, John. Next question I'm going to turn to Alan for. And Alan, this is actually an issue that you and I discussed when I was doing some of the research for our special report on informal science education. And so maybe you want one area to talk about it would be where you and I talked about it, the context of science centers and science museums. How do we increase routine and regular availability for at-risk communities to these types of informal learning opportunities? And maybe add to that, too, to what extent do they face a disadvantage in accessing these sorts of opportunities?
Right. A researcher in our field named Molly Hood did the first studies over 35 years ago on who doesn't make use of cultural facilities like museums. And she expected to find sort of the answers you would expect. Well, they charge admission, so poor people tend not to go, so that's a barrier. Turned out not to be true. It's really a cultural matter. If no one in your family or on your block has ever been to an art museum, you probably don't go to an art museum either. If no one in your family or on your block has ever expressed fascination with science, you probably don't have a fascination with science either. So it is cultural factors more than straightforward socioeconomic factors Now, of course, there's a connection between those, and when you get an entire community which is not engaged in science, they probably have lower average incomes as well. So we need to look at a whole lot of factors to figure out what is causing lack of access and underrepresentation. Yes, it is quite true that working on admission fees and budgets is important. There's a whole movement in the museum world spurred by a theoretician in our field named Elaine Gurian, who says we need to take up Martin Luther King's cry, free at last, and museums like libraries should be completely free to everybody. This certainly would have a major impact, but again, not everything. There are people who won't go even if you make it free, even if you pay them. They would rather go do something else. So those of us who want to engage people in learning outside the classroom, we don't have the power of the truant officer and the law to make people do it. So we've got to find ways to make it so attractive, lower whatever barriers, whether they're financial or geographic or cultural. It's our job to come up with ways to lower those barriers, reduce them, help people have a good time when they're here. And there are lots and lots of things that folks are learning to do in all of the different sectors of informal learning to get people in the door. And then if what they offer once people have their feet inside is really good, we think, and we have some evidence, they will come back. It is a challenge, and it's our responsibility to do it.
Thanks, Alan. And I'll actually chime in for a moment myself with my reporting on science centers, and I visited one in Albuquerque, New Mexico called Explora, where they hosted monthly, or twice a month, I think, Friday science or family science nights, where they actually partnered with the local school district, and they would bring in not just the children, but all their entire family to the science center. And the idea was that the museum had long offered free memberships to low-income families, but many of them didn't know much about the facility and weren't taking advantage of that. So this was a way to get the community and some of these families into the science center who otherwise might not go, which is kind of an interesting way creative way to get a broader representation of the community to take part. Next question is on and let's see, I'll put this out, and whoever wants to grab it. Are there any training programs for teachers to learn how to teach science outside the classroom and relate the learning there to formal science taught in the classroom? And I'm going to also piggyback that with another question that we got. Are there trainings that parents can attend to better equip them to expose their children to science concepts found in museums and other settings?
Well, I'll just jump in and say I wish there were widespread training programs for parents. I'm not aware of any or many, certainly. There are widespread programs available for teachers, even which vary from the smallest scale, as Alan mentioned, particularly science centers, but natural history museums, zoos, have for long been in the business of providing in-service training for teachers. And as part of that in-service training, and often revolving around school field trip programs, there are opportunities for workshops and training. And there are a growing but still relatively modest number of pre-service programs for teachers that try to include training for out-of-school experiences. I will say it's heartening that that latter experience is becoming more common, although it's still not common, but it is becoming more common for universities that are involved and colleges that are involved in teacher training programs to appreciate that training for the out-of-school experience may be an important part of any new teacher's repertoire of knowledge. And I dare say that it is not the same as preparing to teach in a classroom. But that said, in general, there is a dearth of these programs nationwide. And so in any given community, the probability of finding a program, whether you're a parent or a teacher, that would provide opportunities for you that you could readily access and find easily available would probably be challenging at the moment. That's one of those things that obviously if we try to increasingly take the out-of-school more seriously, that needs to change.
Yeah, this is Alan, and we're back to the policy issues. I think science centers and public television stations and radio and after-school programs would just love to be able to offer programs for teachers on how to make better use of what they have. But what the teachers have to sign up for are programs that will support improved test scores on state standardized tests that meet the requirements of No Child Left Behind. And that's primarily reading and math. The No Child Left Behind Act is up for reauthorization, and we are all hoping to see some policy changes that will broaden even in-classroom learning to make science and the arts and the humanities a little more important than they've been the last decade or so. There are such programs, however, which have bucked the trend and do try to do just what John was describing. One of them is at the New York Hall of Science has a program with City College at which all their pre-service science teachers take their training both at the university but also at the Science Museum. And they practice their teaching not only in classrooms but in museums where people can get up and leave if they're not fascinated by what's happening. I think it does make better teachers. But these are small programs compared to the majority. In terms of parents, I have to agree with John. I don't know of any such classes. There may be some, and perhaps some of the people listening on this webinar can let us know what those programs are. There have been a couple of publications, though, that I can recommend, one of them at least. With a grant from the National Science Foundation, the North Carolina Museum of Life and Science prepared a superb pamphlet called Sharing Science with Children, a Guide for Parents. I think it was about 6 pages long. It had all sorts of tips, theoretical and practical, on how to encourage your child's interest, even if you yourself don't have a science background, all sorts of things to do, how to say, how to answer questions, what happens when you don't know the answers, how to encourage your child. I don't know how you get a copy of that. I'm sure that the North Carolina Museum of Life and Science has a website, and there's a way to send them an email, and I'd ask for a copy of that. But it was the best single document I've ever seen for parents on how to share science with your child.
Thanks. So we have time for one last question and probably short answers to this, but this one I like because it sort of dives down to the hands-on nitty-gritty level of, and we could probably apply this to both teachers and, frankly, to parents. What are some best practices for outdoor activities that promote informal science learning?
Well, I would suggest that there are a number of organizations that are deeply committed to this. One of the movements that's beginning is there's a No Child Left Inside movement that's sweeping the United States. I happen to be on the Oregon State's Governor's Task Force to try and create a plan for that. And one of the things that as various states are beginning to put together their plans is the creation of clearinghouses and basically websites that support both teachers and non-teachers' use of best practices for out-of-door experiences. So I would encourage listeners to seek out the website, both national and at the state level, particularly in the state of Maryland, is ahead of the game. I believe Nebraska, Oregon are 3 states that have already developed plans, but there's also a national website for No child left inside. You could also check out the North American Association of Environmental Education. I believe they have some recommendations for outdoor experiences. Those would be two good places to start that search.
Well, and I would add to that, think about the existing activities that already are well organized and have programs for people who want to get involved, like amateur astronomy, like bird watching, like fishing, like collecting flowers. There are all sorts of activities that often, sometimes don't think of themselves as science, but there's a lot of science involved in them. Gardening is my mentor, Mac Letch, used to say that gardeners know more botany than most botanists do. They're out there getting their hands dirty and actually figuring out what it takes to grow tomatoes in a certain soil and lighting level.
And
so,
as of a week ago, Mac was still saying the same thing.
Great. So look for these things that people are doing outside already that have some science content, and then you will find lots of opportunities. One of the slides I showed was citizenscience.org. It is mostly about bird watching, but that's how it started, but no longer. It's now about, about bees and birds and flowers and temperatures and streams, and there are thousands of citizen science projects out there that get you outside collecting real data. And that's a terrific way to become fascinated by science. Do it.
I'm afraid, well, thank you so much. I'm afraid we're out of time. A big thank you once again to John Falk and Alan Friedman for their great presentations and fielding so many questions. And a huge thanks, of course, to our audience today for helping us make this such an engaging and provocative discussion. As I mentioned earlier, an archive of today's discussion and the PowerPoint slides will be available at www.edweek.org within 24 hours. Thanks again, folks. Bye now.
Bye.
Bye.